I just have several slides. My task is to help set the stage and kind of prime your thinking for the breakout rooms we keep referencing. I know there's also lots of folks in the meeting with experience with different data collection methods. So feel free as we go to ask questions or add. I'll pause multiple times just to make sure there's space for interaction if you want. So I want to start with a common misstep that I and others on our team have observed, which is that we get real excited about a data collection activity or a data collection method, or we think we're just supposed to do one. So we say, my checklist says that we need an evaluation, let's do a survey. The point of doing the survey is important to kind of hone in on before designing. So before we choose how we collect data, whether it's a survey, whether it's interviews, whether it's a photo voice project, we need to know what for. And that's why we really wanted to give you some time to think again about evaluation questions that you are looking to answer. I did want to draw a parallel because many of us are educators and in education, that oftentimes when we have a workshop to plan, there is a similar common misstep, which is like, I did this great activity once. I want to do this activity with the participants in our workshop or the students in my session. And we start planning the activity. Many of us have been taught that it's smart to actually pause at that point and say, what are the outcomes we're looking for? What's the learning objectives? And then let's plan backwards from there. And so in evaluation, there's really a similar parallel. What are those bigger evaluation questions we want to learn about? And then let's plan our data collection methods backwards from there. So one of the things to keep in mind when choosing your data collection method is the evaluation question and the purpose of your evaluation. A few other things I wanted to point out that are good to keep in mind when choosing your method is, like I just said, your evaluation questions. Also consider what existing data sources you already have that you could use. Maybe you don't even need to collect new data to answer your question. Maybe you need to just pull out some files with some documents in them, or look at a database and find a way to pull the data in a way that you can do an analysis you haven't done before. So thinking through existing data sources before jumping to collecting new data. And then a very practical one, what resources do you have? So time, technology, financing, what skills do you have on your team to collect and to analyze? A very ambitious data collection plan can sometimes result in data sitting unused, uninterpreted. And so we need to be real. Like if we don't have a ton of time, maybe we just do an emoji waterfall like we did at our last session. Who will you be collecting data from? And here I want to call particular attention to thinking about how you might choose and design your method to take into account and be responsive to perhaps the age of the folks, or the differing abilities of the folks who you're collecting data from, their culture, their language. Are translations important? And the final point on this slide, how you will collect your data and store data in a way that shows respect for people and honors their privacy. And this one's important from an ethical evaluation standpoint, to think about what you're actually going to do with what you collect. Like, does it live in a database somewhere? Who can access it? And particularly if it's in any way sensitive or identifies the people who are involved, privacy is very, very important. But I want to pause here for anyone else who wants to offer something you keep in mind when you're choosing data collection methods, or any questions. Stephen.
I don't want to complicate matters, and I think about how I will analyze them. and that if the methods don't align with the analysis, then there's just more data out there and it's just overwhelming. You spend a lot of time keeping track of it.
Great one in the chat. What about gathering consent? Yes. So with many of the data collection methods you choose to use, it will be important to get either verbal or written consent that they understand what you're using it for. And from whom do you gather consent? Yeah, you're making me realize I kind of wish we had an extra slide or two in this presentation to really cover this. Particularly when collecting data from minors, it becomes important to get consent from a parent or guardian, to be really transparent about where that data will be stored, what it will be used for, will their names be shared? And so very important. Thank you for raising that, and happy to discuss that further, perhaps later in this session and definitely at office hours tomorrow as well. So I do not intend to talk in depth about each of these methods, but wanted to give you a sense that there are a variety of ways out there. Having been a quote unquote professional evaluator, I do feel like I am sick of surveys, interviews, and focus groups, because that is like the toolbox we all go to again and again. And they are sometimes the best. But I wanted to offer some other methods for collecting data that are worth thinking about. So document review, which basically means are there either hard copies or digital files that through a sort of systematic review of those could help you answer your question. Photos and art projects. Remember that data does not have to be words and it does not have to be numbers. I am going to pause because there's something in the chat that I just want to take a minute and look at. Yes, thank you. Do you want to say anything further?
I love all of this work that is very helpful in us being more inclusive and really helping more and more people be outside, but like just remembering that that is the real goal, is for people to get outside and for them to receive benefits from that, and for them to connect with nature and hopefully want to be in a relationship of I can't speak it right now, but of yeah, in a relationship with nature in a good way.
That's great. That makes me think of just two things off the top of my head. One is, could your data collection method, if your program's goal is to help students connect with nature, could your data collection method actually involve some sort of connection with nature so that it's aligned, right? Could it be done outside? And then, of course, the other thing it makes me think about is like, oh, you just named an outcome. That's an outcome that is reflective of your program's definition of success. And so that's important to recognize. That's how you're defining success. There's opportunities to tease that out. What does connection to nature mean? If it's your program staff talking about it or the families who are coming talking about it. So to tease out like that definition of success is one of the topics and themes we've been getting at too. Yeah, and so, and I love that I now have kind of a concrete example I can use as I riff a little bit on these other data collection methods. So I have photos and art projects here. The idea that you might want to learn how students are connecting with nature could definitely involve, instead of asking them directly or having them answer a survey, it could involve some sort of art project or some kind of photo project where those artifacts from that project become your data. There are formal and informal assessments, which are both an educational tool, but can also be a source of data for your evaluation. Basic sign-in sheets are an important tool for collecting data that can often get missed. Like, and I'll say, even in our office, we do a lot of trainings and professional development, and we've been talking about like how can we get better at making sure we understand who's coming.
The photos and art projects are really important for us at Klamath Outdoor School because we've got a final project at the end of the program. And so at the end of that, I usually take a photo of the projects, and then I ask, do you want to be included in the photo? Do you not want to be included in the photo? And you can tell a lot by their facial expressions, whether they want the whole group to take a silly photo too. And then when we're looking at the projects themselves, we can kind of see how well they worked as a team based on the different components that they add into their project. And when they're presenting, like how engaged are each of the students? Do they want to talk about their portion? Are they wanting to lay back and have somebody else read their portion for them? That kind of stuff. And so that kind of goes into accessibility with depending on what they feel comfortable sharing.
That's great. And I also heard in what you're saying a little bit of you're using photos and projects as data collection, and a little bit you're using a form of assessment because you're actually assessing their learning by looking at and observing their projects. I guess the last thing I didn't yet say on this slide says social media metrics. That's yet another data source some people use. The next slide has 4 more, and I'm not going to dwell on these because this is actually, these 4 are the 4 we chose for breakout rooms today. So you will have the opportunity to dig in deeper into one of these 4. I did want to make one more point here, which is that sometimes we talk about data being qualitative or quantitative. Quantitative essentially is numbers that can be analyzed using statistics. Qualitative is everything else. I did want to name that some data sources are pretty much inherently quantitative and some are inherently qualitative, but there's a lot that actually can be both, depending on how you structure them. Surveys, for example, can include closed-ended and open-ended items. Open-ended items become more qualitative and require a qualitative analysis. Observations can mean you're counting something. How many dogs? I once was part of a study where I literally had to count how many dogs were going into the park and how many owners were cleaning up after their dogs. That's quantitative. I could also, on that same observation, be taking detailed notes about the behavior of the dogs in the park. So quantitative, qualitative. Final slide in my little overview here. I just, rather than coming up with my own wording for this, I am just pulling from the data equity deck that I have found really helpful as a resource. And I know the wording is very small, so I'm just going to read some of these other considerations just to get folks thinking. So who on the team is the best person to collect the data given their experience or identities? So maybe you decide on interviews, but who's going to do the interviews? And to recognize that who's doing the interviews can actually influence how the person who's being interviewed might feel. How can participants benefit from sharing with you? So is this purely extractive, or is there something about the experience that can actually be beneficial to the participants? Will all the data you collect be used? And this is an important one, because if you know you're not going to use it, why collect it? And then the final one, who is and isn't being paid for their time, for their knowledge, and for their labor in the valuation? And that's an important thing to think about, both in terms of who is actually collecting the data, who frequently are paid for their work, and who is the data being collected from, who frequently are not being paid for their work. So, so just some additional considerations as you think about how to be culturally responsive, equitable, and really fair in communities that you work with.